Alright. Who wants barbecue?
We are talking about the movie Breach, which is also known as Anti-Life. And this one is directed by John Suits and stars Bruce Willis and Thomas Jane. Now, John Suits actually directed Bruce Willis in a Die Hard car battery commercial, which obviously took a kind of homage from the Die Hard series of films. So I'm assuming that's kind of where he has his relationship with Bruce Willis, because this is a very unusual film for Bruce Willis to star in, quite frankly. It's a very low budget science fiction B-movie. Now, I know Bruce Willis has done a number of kind of low budget TV movies, but this one is low budget. This is the kind of thing, if it didn't have Bruce Willis in it, you would expect to see it on kind of like Wild Eye releasing and stuff like that. It's that kind of movie. Now, it does have a number of familiar faces, that being said. So obviously you've got Bruce Willis here, who is not the main character, but certainly the kind of like the second fiddle, so to speak, in regards to character, but obviously the biggest name here. But in a large role, to be fair. Thomas Jane, just a small role, but you've also got familiar faces. You've got Rachel Nichols, you've got Johnny Messina, Calvin Murray, Timothy Murthy, Ralph Moeller, and just a number of other kind of like recognisable sort of TV actors and kind of small part movies that if you're a kind of a B-movie fan, you'll recognise a few faces. So the story is of this future sort of time where Earth has essentially become uninhabitable, and it focuses on this last ship which is meant to go to New Earth, a new planet where humans have settled. And there is strife on Earth. There's people who don't want, humans to populate other planets, and they think it's kind of weird, parasite, etc. And we have our main character Noah, who is essentially a stowaway on this kind of last ship. Now he is in a relationship with Thomas Jane's daughter. Thomas Jane being the admiral, and he kind of stows away, ends up kind of working in the maintenance crew, whilst everyone else is kind of in hypersleep, apart from a skeleton crew that includes Bruce Willis. Now there seems to be some type of parasitic alien aboard this ship, and it will kind of homage, shall we say, movies like Alien and The Thing in parts of it. Mainly kind of ends up being more of a zombie movie than anything else. And it's up to this kind of skeleton crew of essentially maintenance workers to try and overcome this alien menace. So let's talk about what works. Okay, the cast is fairly impressive, I have to say. Now, obviously the big names here are Bruce Willis and Punisher Thomas Jane. But nonetheless, as I said, I did recognise a good few many names here. Rachel Nichols as well has got a pretty good CV of work here. So I actually thought that it had some kind of recognisable faces, which in a weird way kind of does elevate the movie to a certain point, although we are going to talk about the acting in just a bit. But I did like the cast nonetheless. Now, I think the idea here isn't necessarily a bad one. I think the idea of all these things about different kind of human factions not wanting to go to different planets because they think that humans are going to kind of like mess it up as I did the planet, whilst there's other people who don't really care. There are interesting elements to be had there, and you can argue that yes, you can look at it as a climate change political discussion. The movie isn't really interested in that. It kind of sets these things up as at least just a little bit of an element, but it doesn't really do much with them. But nonetheless, there's good ideas there to a point. The alien themselves, as I said, it mostly takes the form of kind of like making humans into zombies. Obviously, because it's cheaper to do that than have kind of like special alien effects throughout the whole movie. And we do get a kind of a bigger alien sort of CGI monster at the end, which I think people will kind of lag on a little bit, but I don't think it's too bad. It's a little bit kind of like boxy, square and slow moving. But the quality of the CGI I did think was actually too bad, to be honest with you. The movie also ends weirdly on a kind of a scene that will remind you of the other Thomas Jane movie he did, Mist. I won't say too much about that, but nonetheless, I was thinking this seems like an odd little epilogue, but there you go. The movie's relatively kind of well paced. There's plenty of kind of action and set pieces here and there. And Bruce Willis, let's transition. So, I don't know. He had moments in this movie where I feel like he was having a little bit of fun. So, Bruce Willis is my kind of transition into the negativities here. I did like some scenes with Bruce Willis, to be honest. But for the most part, this is pure paycheck gig for him. This is just, you know, let's just kind of just bang it out. Because, yeah, he just doesn't seem like he's particularly kind of that invested, as you probably wouldn't be in such, you know, if you were once an A-list actor who headlined blockbuster movies, and now you're essentially making bottom of the barrel, you know, not much better than kind of like wild-eyed entertainment movies, it's a big fall from grace. And, you know, I get maybe you probably wouldn't want to invest fully in there, but there are a couple of moments here and there where I thought, well, you know, he kind of has a few quips here. So, you know, there's a flash here, you know, once or twice in the movie. But I've got to be honest with you, the acting in this movie, despite the fact that there are some recognisable names here and faces, is pretty poor. Now, I suspect I know why, and although obviously the actors hold some culpability for this, it appears that this movie was probably just very quickly made, and they didn't have a lot of takes and things like that. So there wasn't, you know, obviously, generally speaking, when you make filmmaking, you'll do a variety of takes, and obviously select the best one. And it just doesn't feel like this movie really just had a lot of takes. It was quickly thrown together. I would have imagined that they probably had Bruce Willis for a short time. He is in the movie a lot. He is a main kind of character. So rather than kind of like, if they had him for 2 or 3 days, rather than having a couple of, you know, good scenes with him, they've got him a lot. But they're just like, right, one and done, let's move on. And I suspect that's probably what's happened, because the scenes seem unfinished in a lot of ways, and the acting just doesn't seem like the actors are really kind of comfortable in their roles. They don't really know their characters all that well, and it just seems very rushed in regard to the acting. That is speculation on my part, but that's just how it comes across. So the acting does seem, a lot of the time, like it's just been banged out, and that people just haven't really had chance to know the lines all that well, or really kind of get into the kind of the character and things like that. There's kind of one guy who's like the human bad guy to a point, who I don't want to point it out to you because it's kind of a spoiler, but I think he probably did the best job, if I'm honest. But yeah, for the most part, it's a little wishy-washy. Now, that's not the only problem with the kind of the budgetary constraints of this movie. It really does look super cheap. It looks like they've just kind of like thrown up these kind of like sets or made things to kind of look sci-fi, and, you know, things like their armor and stuff like that looks like motocross armor. It just looks, you know, very kind of cheap. It looks like a 50s kind of like science fiction in regards to kind of set design and things like that. It's a low budget movie, I get it. So, you know, that's kind of par with the course when you kind of do ultimately kind of an alien space adventure. But I've got to point out the fact that these things do look very cheap. And just the kind of like the tech and stuff like that, it comes across as, you can't really afford to do this particularly well. There's holographic kind of like representations of people, and again, it just looks superimposed, very kind of silly and cheesy. Some of the kind of the action sequences and the kind of like the fighting is kind of quite poorly choreographed. Now, Bruce Willis has a stunt double in this, clearly, And I have to be honest with you, it's really jarring when you see scenes with a stunt double, because it kind of looks so obvious. It's basically the only thing they've got in common is that they're bald, but other than that, it's clearly someone else, and they really haven't tried to kind of like hide the fact kind of too much and things like this. But just generally, the kind of the action sequences as a whole, when people are kind of shooting the guns are kind of like, you know, poorly animated muzzle flashes, people's reactions to kind of like shots, things like that. There's no real weight to the weapons. There's, you know, you could pick holes forever in a kind of a movie like this. But ultimately, we will just sum it up by saying this movie really suffers under the budget, because it is just way too ambitious and quickly shot for the budget that the movie's got. And because of that, you can never really kind of become super invested. Now, if you watch my channel and you know my taste in films, I actually don't mind cheaper movies. In fact, I got into B movies way back in the VHS days, and I kind of do like finding these kind of like fun films, and so I can enjoy movies at, you know, at kind of that are cheaper. And I used to like the old VHS, you know, science fiction movies that you kind of got that were kind of cheesy and fun, and it does remind me of them. So in a weird way, you know, if you were a fan of, like, you know, Prison Ship and things like that, then this is kind of in a sort of, maybe not quite as the sexual connotations, but it has that cheesy science fiction, you know, the destruction of Jared's Sin, Metal Storm, things like that. This movie kind of will remind you of those cheesy science fiction movies of the kind of the 80s, because it is a cheesy science fiction movies of the 2020 in actual fact. But I got to be honest with you, I think that's probably a fairly niche market. I have seen, you know, a few reviews of this, and it's like 1, 2 out of 10. I don't think it's that bad. I do think there is some fun, cheesy elements to enjoy in this movie, and I think I can kind of be a little bit more forgiving of some of the kind of the lower budget shortcomings that this movie has compared to some. But I do understand that those are valid criticisms. If you're not a fan of low budget stuff, then you might not want to kind of watch this one. But it's a curious film to see, you know, an A-list, or once an A-list kind of movie star in the real, like, bottom of the barrel indie horror sci-fi movie that honestly would be happy sitting on the bottom shelf of the VHS rental stores in Blockbuster. I'd have one copy. That's the kind of like the weird thing about it. It's weird and enjoyable in that respect, because it feels so out of place. I didn't think our main character was particularly engaging, I have to be honest with you. His girlfriend was even worse, very kind of an annoying character, although she does have quite short screen time here. I'll give it a 4 out of 10. I think there is some entertainment value here, but it is hampered by poor performances, poor production value, a quick running time, well, a quick shooting time, I should say, and just kind of some ultimate cheese. This is super cheesy, very silly, but kind of fun if you like that sort of thing. 4 out of 10. Have you seen it? What did you think of it? Leave me a comment, and I'll look forward to seeing you next time. Bye for now.